The sound of the final chord hung in the air, a perfect shimmering ghost of a note that seemed to fill the entire grand hall of the orphanage. My sister Clara sat at the grand piano, her small frame poised, her blonde curls bouncing as she lifted her hands from the keys with practiced drama. Her gaze, blue and brilliant, swept across the enraptured faces of Mr. and Mrs. Harrison before landing, for a fraction of a second, on me. I stood in the shadows at the back of the room, a ghost of a different sort. In her eyes, I saw not the camaraderie of a sibling, but the cold, triumphant glint of a victor. It was a look I knew better than my own reflection. That concerto, a whirlwind of passion and mathematical precision that had brought tears to Mrs. Harrison's eyes, was not hers. It was mine. Every note, every arpeggio, every heartbreaking crescendo had been born in the quiet recesses of my mind, transcribed onto paper by my hand in the dead of night. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Harrison breathed, her hand clutching the pearls at her throat. "That was breathtaking. To have composed such a masterpiece at only 10 years old, you are truly a prodigy." Mr. Harrison, a man whose face was a permanent mask of shrewd calculation, nodded slowly, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "A prodigy indeed. The world will know the name Clara Harrison." Clara preened, dipping her head in a show of false modesty. "Thank you, sir. It just comes to me." It just came to her because she had stolen it from my locked journal 2 nights ago. The same way she had stolen my equations for accelerated particle physics last month and my architectural blueprints for a self-sustaining habitat the month before that. The orphanage director, Mrs. Gable, beamed, patting Clara's head. "She is our shining star, so gifted. Her sister, Ilara," she trailed off, her gaze flicking dismissively towards me, "is a much more quiet child." Quiet. That's what they called me. Brooding, difficult, jealous. I had screamed, I had cried, I had tried to tell them the truth 100 times in this life, just as I had in the last. But Clara, with her angel's face and serpent's tongue, had always twisted it, painting me as the villain, the liar, the crazy one who couldn't stand her sister's brilliance. In my first life, this was the moment my heart shattered. This was the moment I fought, kicking and screaming as they chose her, as they took her away to a life of unimaginable luxury and prestige, built entirely on the foundations of my stolen genius. This was the beginning of my end, but this was not my first life. As I watched the Harrisons sign the adoption papers, a strange, cold calm washed over me, quenching the fires of rage that had once consumed me. I felt the phantom ache in my chest from the illness that had claimed me in that charity hospital, the ghostly flicker of the television screen where I had watched Clara accept a Nobel Prize for my work just before I drew my final, ragged breath. I had died alone, erased, a footnote in a story I had written. And then I had woken up, 10 years old again, gasping for air in my lumpy orphanage bed, the memories of a full, tragic life crashing down upon me like a tidal wave. I had been given a second chance, and this time I would not waste it on futile battles and pleas for justice. This time I would play a different game. So I stood there, silent in the shadows, and I watched them take her. I watched Clara throw a last venomous smirk over her shoulder as she walked out of my life and into her gilded cage. I let them adopt my talented sister because they didn't know. They had taken the beautiful, glittering facade, but they had left the architect of it all behind. And this time, the architect was going to build their ruin. The first time I died, the world was gray. Not in a metaphorical sense, but a literal one. The walls of the charity hospital ward were a peeling dishwater gray. The thin blanket covering my frail body was a faded, washed-out gray. Even the sky outside the grimy window seemed to be a permanent, oppressive sheet of gray, mirroring the smog of the city and the despair in my soul. I was 28 years old, but my body felt ancient, hollowed out by a combination of malnutrition, stress, and a genetically weak heart that had finally given up the fight. My life with Clara had always been a battle of light and shadow. We were both orphans, abandoned at the steps of the St. Jude's Home for Children when I was 3 and she was a baby. From the beginning, Clara was the light. She had the sunny blonde hair, the sky blue eyes, the infectious giggle that charmed every caregiver and visitor. I was the shadow. My hair was a plain, dark brown, my eyes a serious, watchful gray. While she was learning how to wrap adults around her little finger, I was learning to read. While she was the center of every game, I was in the corner with a book, my mind soaring through worlds of numbers, symbols, and symphonies. The genius came to me as naturally as breathing. I didn't just understand math, I felt it. I didn't just learn music. I heard it in the rhythm of the rain and the patterns of the wind. By the time I was 8, I was secretly devouring university-level physics textbooks I'd managed to sneak from the donation bin. By 9, I was composing complex sonatas in my head and sketching out designs for electromagnetic engines on scraps of paper I kept hidden under a loose floorboard. Clara had no such gifts. Her only true talent was for mimicry and manipulation. She was a magpie, drawn to the shiniest things, and my ideas were the shiniest things in our drab little world. It started small. She would copy my drawings and claim them as her own, earning praise for her artistic flair. Then she began humming my melodies, passing them off as her own little tunes. When I confronted her, she would burst into tears, her big blue eyes welling up as she accused me of being a jealous, mean sister who couldn't stand to see her have anything nice. The adults always took her side. How could this angelic little girl be a thief? It was so much easier to believe that I, the sullen, strange, quiet one, was the liar. I learned to be more careful, to hide my work, but she was relentless. She would rifle through my things when I was asleep, bribe other children to spy on me. She didn't understand my work, not really, but she had an uncanny ability to recognize its brilliance and present it with a confidence I could never muster. The day the Harrisons arrived for the first time was the day the game escalated from childhood squabbles to a life-or-death struggle. Richard and Eleanor Harrison were titans of the tech industry, founders of Harrison Industries, a global conglomerate. They were childless and famously eccentric, having announced their intention to adopt not just a child, but an heir, a proven prodigy who could carry on their legacy. Every orphanage in the state was in a frenzy. At St. Jude S., Mrs. Gable pushed Clara forward as our champion. For weeks, Clara had been watching me, her eyes gleaming with a familiar predatory light. I was working on something big, a breakthrough in data compression that could revolutionize information storage. I knew she was after it, so I kept my notes in a complex cipher, my own private language. It wasn't enough. The night before the Harrisons' visit, Clara didn't try to steal my notes. She drugged my evening milk with a sleeping draught she'd sweet-talked out of the infirmary nurse. While I was unconscious, she sat by my bed and coaxed the concepts out of me in my sleep-addled state, recording every word. The next day, she stood before the Harrisons and presented my algorithm, my beautiful, intricate, world-changing algorithm, as her own. She didn't understand the math, but she had memorized the key phrases, the revolutionary outcomes, and she delivered them with a politician's poise. The Harrisons were thunderstruck. They adopted her on the spot. My protests were dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed and envious child. When I screamed that she was a fraud, I was locked in the quiet room for a week. The official story became that my jealousy of my sister's good fortune had finally broken my fragile mind. The years that followed were a slow, grinding descent into hell. Clara Harrison became a media sensation, the billion-dollar baby. Harrison Industries poured its limitless resources into developing the ideas she fed them, my ideas. Every few months, a new Clara Harrison innovation would be unveiled to breathless fanfare. A new medical scanner, a more efficient solar panel, a groundbreaking software suite, all of it stolen from the life's work of a sister she had left to rot. I aged out of the orphanage and was cast into the world with nothing. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college, then earned a scholarship to a state university. I lived on instant noodles and stale coffee, fueled by a burning, obsessive need to reclaim what was mine. I tried to beat them to the punch. I'd be on the verge of a breakthrough, only to see Harrison Industries announce a patent for the exact same technology a week before I could. Clara still had her sources, people from the orphanage who she paid to keep tabs on me, to report on my studies, my interests. She was always one step ahead. I tried to expose her legally. I presented my old notebooks, my dated research. But against the Harrison Empire's army of lawyers, I was nothing. They countersued me for harassment for intellectual property theft, claiming I was the one stealing her ideas. They painted me as a delusional stalker, a parasite trying to latch onto her famous sister's success. And the world, which so loved the story of the beautiful orphan prodigy, believed them. They destroyed me. They bankrupted me, professionally and financially. My name was mud in the academic and scientific communities. No one would hire me. No one would listen to me. The constant stress shattered my health. My weak heart began to fail. In the end, I was just Alara Reed, the crazy woman who claimed a genius had stolen her life. My last memory was of that gray hospital room. A charity gala was playing on the small television mounted in the corner. Clara was on stage, radiant in a diamond-studded gown, accepting the prestigious Sterling Medal for Innovation, an award named after the Harrisons' biggest rival, a delicious irony, for her work in quantum computing. It was for a theory I had finalized on a crumpled napkin in a homeless shelter a year prior, a napkin that had disappeared from my coat pocket shortly after. I'd like to thank my parents, the Harrisons, for always believing in me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And I'd like to remember my sister, Alara. We lost touch many years ago, but I hope wherever she is, she has found peace. She struggled so much, and I'll always regret that I couldn't save her from her own demons. The hypocrisy was so vast, so complete, it was almost sublime. A wave of blackness washed over me, a final, crushing weight of injustice. My last thought was a bitter, desperate wish. If I had one more chance, I would make them all pay. And then there was a gasp. My own. I was 10 years old in my lumpy bed, the morning sun streaming through the dusty window of the St. Jude's dormitory. The air was thick with the scent of bleach and oatmeal. It was real. It was all real. My past life, the betrayal, the slow ruin, the lonely death. It wasn't a dream, it was a memory. A week. I had 1 week until the Harrisons were due to arrive. In my first life, I had spent that week in a feverish panic, trying to perfect my data compression algorithm, the very thing that would be my downfall. Now, I knew better. The rage was still there, a cold, hard diamond in my chest. But it was no longer a wild, chaotic fire. It was a focused, controlled burn. Vengeance required a plan. It required a foundation. This time, I wouldn't try to stop Clara. I would pave her path to glory with landmines. My plan began not with confrontation, but with creation. For the first 2 days after my rebirth, I barely slept. I filled page after page of a new notebook with the fruits of my past life's tormented labor, this time with the clarity of hindsight. I didn't just write down the solutions, I mapped out their flaws, their weaknesses, the elegant, almost invisible tripwires I could weave into their very fabric. The first piece of bait was the music. In my past life, I had composed that concerto in a fit of youthful passion, a pure expression of my soul. This time, I wrote it with surgical precision. It was still beautiful, still breathtakingly complex, but I built it around a recurring 5-note theme. A musical signature that was simple enough for a child to remember, yet intricately woven into the very structure of the piece. It would be my brand, a watermark no one would notice until I was ready to reveal it. I accidentally left the sheet music on the piano in the deserted music room, knowing Clara's insatiable curiosity and arrogance would do the rest. Sure enough, the next day, the sounds of my concerto played hesitantly at first, then, with growing confidence, echoed through the halls. Mrs. Gable was ecstatic, proclaiming that Clara's genius had reached a new plateau. Clara simply smiled, accepting the praise as her due. The second and most crucial piece of bait was a series of notebooks. I filled them with my most advanced concepts from my previous life. There was the design for a bio-integrated neural interface, the formula for a self-replicating nanomaterial, and the crown jewel, the theoretical framework for Project Chimera, a global wireless energy network that could solve the world's power crisis. They were revolutionary ideas, worth not just billions but trillions, and each one was fundamentally catastrophically flawed. The flaw in the neural interface would cause synaptic degradation after 1,000 hours of use. the nanomaterial would lose its integrity when exposed to common atmospheric nitrogen, and Project Chimera. Its core energy transference algorithm contained a recursive loop that, once activated on a global scale, wouldn't just fail. It would create a harmonic cascade, destabilizing any power grid it was connected to, potentially causing continent-wide blackouts. They were time bombs, ticking away at the heart of my most brilliant work. And only I knew how to defuse them. I bundled these notebooks together and hid them in the one place I knew Clara would look, under the loose floorboard where I had kept my treasures in our first life. With the trap set for Clara and the Harrisons, I turned to my own escape. My past self had been so focused on high-concept, world-changing ideas that I had ignored the more conventional paths to success. I remembered a footnote from that life: the Legrand National Mathematics Olympiad, a competition for students under 18. The grand prize was a full 4-year scholarship to the prestigious Blackwood Academy of Science and a personal mentorship with its primary benefactor, a man named Julian Sterling. Sterling, the man whose company, Sterling Industries, had been the Harrisons' biggest rival. The man whose name was on the award Clara had been accepting when I died. The irony was too perfect to ignore. He was known for being a true maverick, a man who valued raw talent over pedigree. He was my way out. He was my future. While Clara was practicing her concerto and poring over her newfound trove of genius, I was the model of a defeated child. I became even more withdrawn and quiet. I let my grades and regular schoolwork slip. I feigned difficulty with simple long division, earning pitying looks from the teachers and scornful ones from Clara. To the outside world, it looked like the quiet sister had finally given up, crushed under the weight of her siblings' dazzling brilliance. It was the perfect camouflage. Every night, while the orphanage slept, I worked. Using a stub of a pencil and salvaged paper, I solved the previous year's Olympiad problems. They were challenging, but for a mind that had wrestled with quantum mechanics, they were child's play. Then, I began working on my own original thesis for the competition's open problem, something that would not just win, but would make an unforgettable impression. I chose a topic that was deliberately obscure but foundational: a new theorem for resolving prime number distributions. It was elegant, unassailable, and, most importantly, had absolutely nothing to do with the flashy, marketable tech I had fed to Clara. It was pure, beautiful mathematics, my own. The day the Harrisons arrived played out exactly as I remembered and exactly as I had planned. Clara's performance was flawless. They were mesmerized. When they asked her about her other interests, she coyly mentioned her little notebooks of ideas. Mr. Harrison's eyes lit up as she paraphrased the introductions to my work on nanotechnology and neural interfaces. The adoption was a foregone conclusion. As they were leaving, Mrs. Harrison paused and looked at me, still standing in the corner. For a moment, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed her face. "It must be difficult, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "to live in such a brilliant shadow. But don't you worry. We will ensure Clara never forgets where she came from. She will be a benefactor to this orphanage one day." I looked at her, at this woman who had enabled my destruction once before, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear focus. I didn't offer a bitter retort. I didn't cry. I simply nodded and said, in a small, quiet voice, "She's very special. Please take good care of her." The words were a promise and a curse. They left, taking Clara with them. The orphanage buzzed with the news for weeks. I ignored it. 2 days after Clara was gone, I sealed my Olympiad submission in an envelope and mailed it. Then I waited. 6 weeks later, a long black car I recognized from news articles in my past life pulled up to St. Jude S. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. It was not Richard Harrison. It was Julian Sterling. He walked into Mrs. Gable's office, and a few minutes later she emerged, her face pale and confused. "Elara," she stammered, looking at me as if for the first time. "Mr. Sterling is here. He wants to see you." I stood up and walked towards the office, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The turning point was here. The game had begun. The next 10 years were a study in contrasts. While Clara's star ascended in a blaze of public glory, Mine was cultivated in quiet, methodical solitude. Julian Sterling was everything Richard Harrison was not. Where Harrison was a marketer, a showman who bought innovation rather than understanding it, Sterling was a builder, an engineer at heart. He had personally reviewed my Olympiad submission and had seen what no one else had. Not just the answer to a problem, but the mind that had formulated it. During our first meeting in Mrs. Gable's drab office, he didn't coddle me. He sat across from me, my paper in his hands, and fired off a series of questions, each more complex than the last. He pushed at the edges of my theorem, testing its integrity, searching for the limits of my knowledge. For the first time in either of my lives, I was not being judged or dismissed. I was being challenged. It was exhilarating. At the end of an hour, he leaned back, a slow, impressed smile spreading across his face. "The board of the Blackwood Academy has approved your full scholarship," he said, his voice direct. "And I am personally overriding the mentorship lottery. You'll be working with me." Life at Blackwood was like breathing fresh air after a lifetime in a dungeon. I was surrounded by minds that worked like mine, by teachers who encouraged my insatiable curiosity. Under Sterling's guidance, I flourished. He gave me resources, a lab, and most importantly, anonymity. While Clara Harrison was on the cover of magazines, hailed as the teen genius revolutionizing technology, I was simply student 1138, devouring knowledge and building my arsenal. I kept a close watch on her and Harrison Industries. It was all so predictable. Just as I had planned, she fed them my flawed inventions one by one. They launched the Harrison Neuralink, based on my neural interface. It was a massive success initially, used by gamers and professionals alike. I knew that in about 5 years, the first reports of synaptic degradation and early-onset dementia would start trickling in. They announced a new line of advanced materials based on my self-replicating nanites. Their stock soared. I knew that the first time those materials were used in a large-scale atmospheric construction project, they would disintegrate into dust, and all the while they were pouring billions into their ultimate project, the one Mr. Harrison had staked his entire legacy on, Project Chimera, the global wireless energy network. It was the centerpiece of their new City of the Future, a massive undertaking that would make them legends. Meanwhile, I was building my own legacy in the shadows. With Sterling's backing, I began to solve problems under a new pseudonym, Eon. When a critical satellite system failed, Eon anonymously submitted the patch that saved it. When a new superbug resisted all known antibiotics, Eon published the molecular key to defeating it. Eon became a legend in the underground tech community, a ghost in the machine, a genius without a face or a past. No one knew who Eon was, but they knew the work. It was always elegant, always revolutionary, and always perfect. I was also carefully laying a trail of breadcrumbs, publishing my foundational work, the pure, theoretical stuff, in obscure academic journals under my real name, Ilara Reed. They were dense, esoteric papers that the marketing-driven R&D department at Harrison Industries would never bother to read. But they were there, dated and time-stamped, a public record of my true work, hidden in plain sight. I played the long game, piece by patient piece. As my 20th birthday approached, I knew the time was coming. Harrison Industries announced the official launch date for Project Chimera. It was to be a global media event, broadcast live from their gleaming new headquarters. Investors had poured trillions into the project. Governments had signed contracts. It was the culmination of everything. It was to be their greatest triumph. A week before the launch, I went to Julian Sterling. I walked into his office, no longer a quiet, overlooked orphan, but a confident young woman, his partner and his protege. "It's time," I said simply. He nodded, his expression serious. "Are you ready for this, Ilara? Once you step out of the shadows, there's no going back." "I've been in the shadows my whole life," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm ready for the sun." We planned my reveal with the same meticulous detail I had applied to everything else. Sterling called an emergency global tech summit for the same day as the Chimera launch, inviting every major industry player and media outlet. The keynote speaker was a mystery, billed only as the first public appearance of Eon. The bait was set. The world's attention would be divided, and curiosity was a powerful weapon. The morning of the launch, I stood backstage at the Sterling Auditorium, watching a monitor that showed the pre-show at the Harrison event. There she was, Clara, my sister, looking regal and brilliant in a designer suit, standing beside Richard and Eleanor Harrison. They looked so proud, so utterly triumphant. They were on top of the world, unaware they were standing on a trapdoor. An assistant clipped a microphone to my lapel. 5 minutes, Miss Eon, she whispered. I took a deep breath. Eon was about to die and Alara Reed was about to be reborn. The Harrison event started first. On the monitor, I watched Richard Harrison walk to the podium, his voice booming with pride. Today is not just a new day for technology, he declared. Today is a new day for humanity itself, and it is all thanks to the unparalleled genius of one young woman, my daughter, Clara Harrison. The crowd roared. Clara stepped forward, smiling and waving. She began her speech, filled with the usual platitudes about dreams and the future, words that meant nothing, written for her by a PR team. At that moment, on the other side of the city, Julian Sterling walked onto the stage of his own event. The room was packed. Every camera, every eye in the tech world was on him. "Welcome," he began, his voice cutting through the expectant hush. For years, we have all benefited from the work of a singular, anonymous talent known only as Eon, a mind that has reshaped our world from the shadows. Today, the shadows recede. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce you to the mind behind Eon, Miss Alara Reed. I walked out from the wings into a blinding wall of light. 1,000 cameras flashed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Reed? The name was unfamiliar. I looked nothing like the reclusive genius they might have imagined. I was just a young woman in a simple black dress. I walked to the podium and took a steadying breath. I looked directly into the main broadcast camera, knowing that on screens across the world, my face was now side by side with Clara's. My name is Alara Reed, I began, my voice clear and strong, resonating through the auditorium. And for the last decade, my sister, Clara Harrison, has been living my life. The room erupted, I held up a hand, and silence fell. I know this is a shocking claim, and I have not come here today with just claims. I have come with proof. On the massive screen behind me, a video began to play. It was grainy footage taken from a hidden camera I had planted in the orphanage music room all those years ago. It showed a 10-year-old me sitting at the piano, my fingers flying across the keys. The music was unmistakable. It was the concerto. Her concerto. The date and timestamp were clearly visible in the corner. This is me at 10 years old, composing and performing the piece that launched my sister's career, I said calmly. Gasps echoed through the hall. On the split-screen monitor, I could see the confusion starting to ripple through the Harrison event. This musical piece contains a 5-note signature theme, I continued, as my presentation shifted to a side-by-side analysis of the concerto and half a dozen other pieces of software and algorithms credited to Clara. A musical watermark that, when translated algorithmically, is also the foundational security key for every major innovation she has ever claimed as her own. The screen filled with data, with code, with mathematical proofs that were undeniable. A wave of frantic typing could be heard as every tech journalist in the room began verifying my claims in real time. But I am not here today to talk about stolen music or plagiarized code, I said, my voice turning colder. I am here to talk about Project Chimera, the global energy network that is scheduled to go live in less than 1 hour. I looked back at the camera. And I am here to tell you that if it is activated, it will be the single greatest technological catastrophe in human history. Panic, pure, unadulterated panic. On the monitor, I saw Richard Harrison's face go white. He was shouting at his technicians, his composure shattering. The core transference algorithm of Project Chimera is based on my theoretical work, I explained, as the screen behind me displayed the elegant, beautiful math. Work my sister stole from my childhood notebooks. But she and her team of engineers missed something. They lacked the foundational understanding to see the fatal flaw I placed within it. A simulation began to run on the screen. It showed a map of the world with the Chimera network activating. For a few seconds, it glowed with power. Then, a red rot began to spread from the nodes. A cascade failure. City after city went dark, continents plunged into blackness. A recursive harmonic flaw, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. It won't just fail to transmit power, it will actively destabilize and destroy every grid it touches. It is a poison pill for the world's infrastructure, a Trojan horse I created 10 years ago, waiting for this very day. The reveal was complete. On the other stage, Clara was frozen, her face a mask of utter horror and disbelief. Reporters were swarming her, shouting questions she couldn't possibly answer. What is the root function of the algorithm? What is the fail-safe for the harmonic cascade? She just stared blankly, the puppet with her strings finally cut. Richard Harrison grabbed a microphone, his face purple with rage. She's lying! This is a trick! A corporate sabotage attempt by Sterling. Is it? I countered from my own stage, my voice cutting through his tirade. Then activate it, Mr. Harrison. Go ahead. Show the world the power of your daughter's genius. Push the button. He froze. His eyes darted to his lead engineer, who was shaking his head frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. They had found the flaw. They knew I was telling the truth. He didn't push the button. He couldn't. In that single moment of hesitation, his entire empire, his legacy, and his stolen daughter were all exposed as a hollow fraud. Harrison Industries stock, displayed on every news ticker, began to plummet. It was a vertical drop, a nosedive into oblivion. They were ruined, and the whole world was watching. I looked at Clara's crumbling face on the monitor one last time. The smirk was gone. The triumphant glint in her eye had been replaced by a vacant, shattering terror. She had finally been asked to show her work, and she had nothing. She was nothing. I turned away from the monitor and faced my own audience, my own future. Now, I said, a small, genuine smile finally touching my lips. Let me tell you about a project that actually works. Let me tell you about Project Prometheus. The aftermath was less a storm and more of a global cleansing. The fall of Harrison Industries was swift and absolute. With their credibility annihilated and their flagship project exposed as a multi-trillion-dollar time bomb, investor lawsuits buried them within a week. The Harrisons lost everything: their company, their fortune, their social standing. Their name became a byword for the most audacious fraud in corporate history. They tried to publicly disown Clara, painting themselves as victims of her deception. But no one bought it. They were the adults who had exploited a child's supposed genius for their own gain. Their greed was as culpable as her plagiarism. The other time bombs I had planted began to detonate. A class action lawsuit from thousands of Harrison Neuralink users suffering from premature neurological decay. The catastrophic failure of a new aerospace facility built with my defective nanomaterials. Every pillar of their stolen legacy crumbled to dust, just as I had designed. Clara simply broke. Stripped of her awards, her fame, and the shield of the Harrison name, she was left with only herself, and there was nothing there. She had spent her life as a reflection of my brilliance, and when the source was revealed, the reflection vanished. She couldn't face the world, couldn't answer the endless questions, or bear the weight of the global humiliation. The last I heard, the Harrisons, in a final act of public relations, had her quietly committed to a high-end private institution for nervous exhaustion. The gilded cage had become a padded cell. She got the life of quiet solitude she had always forced upon me. My life, on the other hand, had just begun. Project Prometheus, the perfected and safe version of my energy network, was implemented globally by a consortium led by Sterling Industries. It worked flawlessly, revolutionizing the world and ushering in a new era of clean, abundant energy. Eon was a mystery no more. Ilara Reed was a name spoken with the kind of reverence once reserved for Einstein or Curie. With the immense wealth and influence I now commanded, I established the Reed Foundation, an organization dedicated to finding and nurturing gifted, underprivileged children, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones society might otherwise discard. I built schools and labs that were havens, not showcases, ensuring that no child's brilliance would ever be stolen or silenced again. Years passed, the world healed from the Harrison debacle and moved forward, powered by my work. I never saw Clara or the Harrisons again. They were ghosts from a past life, a lesson learned, and a debt collected. One evening, I was standing on the observation deck of the Sterling Reed Tower, the tallest building in the city, looking out at the millions of lights twinkling below, all powered by my design. Julian Sterling, now a gray-haired and endlessly proud old man, stood beside me. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked quietly. I thought back to the gray hospital room, the crushing weight of a life stolen, the utter despair of being erased. I remembered the little girl in the orphanage crying in the dark, her only treasures hidden under a floorboard. And I looked out at the vibrant living city, at the tangible proof of a life reclaimed. "They made their choice, Julian," I said, my voice soft but firm. "They chose the beautiful painting over the artist. They didn't realize the artist could simply paint a new world." He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of deep, paternal affection. "And a beautiful world it is, Alara." A genuine smile touched my lips, one that reached my eyes without reservation. The rage was gone, the cold diamond of vengeance in my chest having long since melted away, leaving behind not a void, but a profound and lasting peace. Justice had been served, the story had been rewritten, and this time, I was holding the pen. I was finally, completely free.